let's move on to the next session where we'll have a fireside chat with David. David, can you join us for the call? Just I want to make sure that everything's okay on your side.
Everything should be here.
Yes.
Hi there.
Yes. Hey, hi, David. Welcome once again to the summit. Let me just get started with a quick introduction, although I'm not sure how many people in this call would actually need an introduction to you. But let me get this started anyway. So for folks in the audience who don't know David, David Raab is the founder and CEO of the Customer Data Platform Institute, a vendor-neutral organization with over 10,000 members, which essentially educates marketers and technologists about customer data management. David has a long and storied history as an independent consultant, helping marketers understand, find, deploy MarTech and vendors. His client list includes Global 2000 firms in retail, financial services, telco, publishing, and many other industries. He holds a bachelor's degree from Columbia University and an MBA from Harvard Business School. He has written hundreds of articles and blog posts on marketing tech and regularly speaks and teaches at events around the world. Long introductions aside, David is the father of our industry, or as millennials today would call it, David, the OG of the CDP space. So thank you very much. Thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here. Always good to see you, Subra.
David, let's just get started by talking about some of the trends between the last time we spoke in the last summit and now, and sort of what is same, what is different. Let's maybe talk about some of these trends. And I think, is it fair to say, to start off with, that in general, the demand for and the interest in CDPs have clearly gone up across all regions in the world? Are you seeing that as well? And if yes or if no, what sort of your take there?
Oh, we definitely see growth across the world. North America and Northern Europe kind of led the way, but we now are seeing much more growth in Southern Europe. APAC, again, different areas in APAC. Some were a little quicker than others to adapt it, but India, for example, very, very quick. But now really all across all of APAC, we see a definite rise in interest in CDP. And that's driven by digital transformation, by the pandemic, which made a lot of companies do more online and really forced them to accelerate changes that they kind of sort of knew they wanted to make, but they were moving along at relatively slow paces. And then this really just forced them to do those things. So there's been a very definite growth and interest in CDP.
And there was also this emerging trend of a couple of things. Let me start with one, which is that, we are actually seeing clients actually go through their second attempt at implementing CDPs, right? Or maybe they have tried it in some shape or form, either with one vendor and trying for another, or they tried it as a data lake and trying something else. So are you again seeing this, that in some parts of the world or with certain verticals, you're seeing this trend of a second attempt, and what are the learnings that these kind of customers seem to be having?
Oh, there's definitely people who are out there buying their second or possibly in some cases their third CDP. We see this in the varying surveys. And we think in most cases, it's interesting because if you look at the data, on the one hand, they're out there looking for a new product. I think they're pretty satisfied with what they got from the original product. So it's not so much that the original product didn't work, it's that they needed more, they needed something different. So they got their feet wet, they understood what a CDP was going to be able to do for them. They got value out of that first system. They said, well, there are other things that we want to do. We want to use it in other departments. We want to bring in more data types, and we want some more functionality or some more connectivity. There are lots of specific reasons that a particular company might decide that it wants to go out and at least look for a different CDP. All those are happening. And, that's a good thing. It's a sign of maturity in the industry. Often it's a sign of growth in the use of the CDP within the organization. They got a CDP, say, for marketing purposes, and it did what it did. But now there are people outside of marketing who want to use it. They say, well, maybe there's a better system to support those other requirements.
So that sort of feeds into one of the things we spoke of as well, David, recently, which is that there also seems to be this trend where initially when sort of CDP started getting adopted, you had practically every department having its own CDPs. It was fairly commonplace for me to hear that, oh, I've got a bunch of CDPs in my company, depending on the function. But I think there is a shift to sort of a more centralized enterprise CDP, if you will, which, as you rightly said, is also accompanied by interest in IT departments wanting to build by some of these. So talk to us about this. How did this evolution happen? Why is it important for people to understand if they're still considering sort of multiple CDPs?
Well, the first thing you have to realize, and the reason I was laughing before, is, of course, people will say they have a CDP, whether they have what you or I would consider a CDP or not. Right? They say, oh, of course we have one of those. What is it again? But whatever it is, we have one, because nobody wants to admit that they don't. There was a great deal of confusion, and still, unfortunately, is a great deal of confusion about what a CDP is. Some people think a CDP is any system with customer data in it. In which case, yeah, they all have quite a few of those, right? Everybody has lots of systems with customer data. So that's part of the reason that we would get those answers early on, and we saw that again in all the data that we did as well. I think there is, if not a truly deep understanding of what a CDP is, which makes me sad because I spent the last 6 years of my life trying to educate people, but I guess I can't quit quite yet. But they at least understand what they need. And whether they got the label right or not, they really do understand the value of pulling all the data together in one place. They do understand the difficulty of pulling all the data in one place. And now, as you say, there are enterprise IT departments that before were willing to say, it's just a marketing tool, let the marketers do whatever they want. We don't really care as long as they don't pester us too much. Who are hearing that there are other groups in the company who have similar needs, or the other groups, as we said earlier, have seen what the marketers do and say, hey, that's great, I want to do that too. And the minute it gets beyond a single department, it becomes an enterprise concern. And then they jump in and they then have their own interests and priorities and opportunities and resources. Many of them do say, oh, we can build that. And that's been probably the most interesting development in the last year or so in the industry, is this much, much accelerated interest in companies building their own CDP equivalent. Now, by definition, at least by our definition, a CDP is packaged software. So by definition, you can't build it because you don't build packaged software unless you happen to be a software company. But setting that aside, and we don't want to be too pedantic, to build a system that has the functionality of a CDP is a lot of work. There was a very interesting announcement yesterday from one of the vendors, who's basically a reverse ETL vendor, who had added a profile building capability. And they already actually had a data ingestion capability. And those are the three big components of a CDP. And their press release was, oh, this will save months and months of work and all the stuff that you would have. Of course, these are the same people who, 6 months ago were saying, oh, well, you already have a data warehouse. Why should you buy a CDP? Because it's just so easy to tack a reverse ETL tool onto a data warehouse. And now that they have a tool that does the hard work, the identity resolution, the profile creation, all the other things, say, well, that's a lot of work to do that if you don't have a tool to do this. So there's this realization that it's not just taking a data warehouse, which is what a lot of the IT guys think kind of at first blush. There is actually a lot of very specific work that needs to be done to create a customer profile, which is the core thing that a CDP does. So in that regard, at least, there has been a little progress and a little better understanding in the world of what's really required.
And what would you tell, or let's say you have to arm genuine CDP enthusiasts who are trying to implement and not really look at it as a data warehouse? Let's say they're fighting with their IT firms on the IT department saying it's a data warehouse and we already have a CDP. If you have to arm these people with two or three things they can say, which will help them sort of manage all the key objections that generally come up, what would those be? Like, for example, one of the, in the Mumbai summit, we had Subhashish Ghosh from Kotak Life, who used this very telling phrase. He said, you know what, if you want to be close to the customer, a data lake is not going to work. You need a proper CDP. And that I thought was just a pithy way of putting things across. But if you had to like maybe give 2 or 3 things that, inputs, what would those look like?
So our general attitude here, which is perhaps just a personal preference, is to be non-confrontational. Say, okay, Mr. IT department or Ms. IT department, you want to do this, just be sure you understand what you're getting into. There are specific things that a CDP has to do that a typical data warehouse does not do. Identity resolution is a primary one. Understanding how all the different identifiers and all the different systems can be combined to build a true unified customer profile, create an identity graph. Most data warehouses don't do that. Most IT departments have no clue how to do that. A little different in like financial services where you live, because the financial services guys have kind of had to do that for money laundering and anti-fraud and things like that. But when you get out of financial services, actually, it's pretty unusual for an IT department to really understand identity management. So that's one thing we say, look at that closely, really understand what you're getting into. The second thing that we want them to look at closely is real time. Yeah. Because most data warehouses don't do real time. They weren't built for it. There's really no reason. Data warehouses are built primarily as tools to support analysis. They're not, analysis, you pull out a data set and you work with your data set. There's really no need for real-time access. So most of the technologies, most of the database technologies that are used in data warehouses simply aren't built to support real-time. Those are the 2 big ones. And the other things that you worry about are connectors, both in terms of getting data in from source systems. Some of those will be feeding your warehouse. Some of them won't be. So how much additional work will it be to add in the sources that you really care about? And these are non-trivial connectors because you really have to get the data in just quite so. And on the other end as well, the connectors to the activation systems, either the analytical systems that are doing your modeling or the delivery systems that are delivering your messages. Well, how many of those is your warehouse connected to? And the answer is probably 0. And what's it going to take to build those connections? And again, you can't just say, oh, reverse ETL will do that. Reverse ETL is a batch technology. Doesn't do real time. Not what reverse ETL does. So it's not. These are not. Those are the things that they need to look at very carefully. And hopefully, if they're honest with themselves, they come to the conclusion, wow, this is really a lot of work. If I can buy a system, a packaged system like a CDP that does all this for me, that's probably a good choice, even though it might mean replicating some data, because that's the big thing that concerns the IT department. Say, hey, we have this data in the warehouse. We really don't want to make a copy of it. It's just sort of bad, sort of on a global sense, to make a copy of data. There are synchronization issues, there are security issues, there are lots of valid reasons to minimize the amount of copying that you do. But minimizing the amount of copying and flat out refusing to do copying are different things. There are some situations, and the CDP is one of them, where you do want to do the copying despite the disadvantage. It's simply worth paying that price to get the value that you're going to get. So that's the thought process that we try to lead IT departments through to kind of come to their own conclusion. Because if we just say it, they probably won't believe us.
Yep. Stay away from conflict for sure. There is also this trend of CDPs wanting to access sort of external data without actually importing it, right? And one use case, at least that I saw, was where 2 non-competing enterprises wanted to share some data sets with each other, but just sort of look at what the other has and maybe use it in some aggregated form to sort of create value for themselves. I don't know if there are other use cases, but would be interesting to hear from you about this particular trend. Why did it emerge, and what are some of the use cases that you're seeing?
Yeah, this is a very interesting trend and definitely a very substantial one. Part of it comes back to that IT department discussion that we just had, where again, we don't want to replicate all the data. So the CDP vendors say, well, okay, that's fair enough. You don't have to replicate all the data. If you want a tool that will let you access the data that's in place in existing systems, we can add that kind of connection into the CDP. It's not trivial. I mean, the vendors who have done it, the CDP vendors who have done it, are kind of very proud of themselves, which always makes you assume that there was a fair amount of work involved. And it's not something you can assume every CDP can do, but it does reduce the amount of data copying, which is a benefit. What it also does is it gives you access to data that you would never in a million years want to copy. Either there's too much of it, so call detail records in telco. There are a lot of call detail records in telco. And replicating that volume of data is going to be very, very costly. Data that changes frequently, inventory levels. You're not going to import your inventory levels and update them in real time in the CDP because you only use them once in a while. Local weather conditions, which are very important for a lot of marketing. You're not going to constantly update the local weather conditions of all of your customers in every location. You're just going to go out when a customer comes in. You're going to look where they are and go out and find what the weather is in that particular location and just bring it in as you need it. So there are actually quite a number of use cases where having that external data access makes sense. Now, that happens to be a very standard capability, federated data access. The IT guys understand that one. It's been used for many reasons over the years. So it's not a technically new challenge, and it's not an unfamiliar concept, which is always nice if you don't have to explain it to people. But for the CDPs, which originally were all about building their own data, it's been a bit of an adjustment to say, okay, we don't have to bring it all in. We can find ways to give access to some of the external data on an as-needed basis.
Got it. Our friend Scott recently spoke about the rise of ops. I think he wrote a post about it some time back as well. Whether you look at data and data ops, revenue ops, you have product ops, design ops now. Essentially, the need to have highly specialized ops functions in marketing and revenue teams. In fact, in the keynote session we had before, Jason also spoke about the need to have people, train people, and sort of have them in place. So invariably, when we speak of ops, there is also this question of how much of this is product versus how much of this is services. So the typical product versus services, where how much of it is something that the product/CDP should support, and how much of this is ops, right? So do you see this as something that is at odds with, or sort of in alignment with the overall CDP philosophy?
I have no problem at a philosophical level with there being ops people who manage the CDP. If you look at how CRM systems have been deployed, or any other kind of marketing automation systems, there's always going to be an ops person who's really the user expert. There's not a lot of value in training every marketer in your company to be an expert in the operation of any of those systems. You have admins who can do the more complicated things. You want to add a new data source. It really makes sense to have that handed off to a specialist who understands what's involved in that, because it's a fairly technical chore. You want to create a new connection to an external system. You want to add some new data elements. Even though CDPs are very flexible when it comes to adding data elements, there's still some work involved. So yeah, any company of any size, you would expect to have specialists who are going to manage the operation of those systems. But as with marketing automation and CRM and the rest, there are other activities that you do want your business users or your end users to do for themselves. You don't want to have to go to an ops person to create a new segment. You should have a segment builder that lets the marketer not just create a segment, but kind of play around with it and see what's in the segments, and try different versions of segmentation, and do a lot of complicated things that are sort of stream of thought, where what happens if I do this? What happens if I do that? You don't want to have to go to an ops person every time you have one of those little what happens if I do questions, because now instead of doing something in minutes, you're doing something in weeks, right? As you go back and forth. So there's a lot of self-service capabilities in a CDP, and that grows over time. The vendors keep adding new capabilities, but there are some things that are better done by ops people. Let ops be ops. And let marketers be marketers, and give the marketers as much control as they can reasonably take, but don't expect them to become ops people themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point you break. I think especially if you look at the sourcing of data itself as you try to bring it into the CDP, there needs to be somebody sitting there that's sort of trying to link the business objectives with the available data and figure out how to sort of massage it into the CDP. And I think there is definitely a sort of, and often, especially when you have enterprise CDPs, these data points tend to be spread across different department. So you really need that sort of layer, if you can call it that, of data ops to bring it into the CDP, I thought, right? So yeah, that's definitely a, so there are use cases for ops, but I think what you're saying is have enough self-serve so that the actual utility of the CDP is not impacted by people coming in. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are things like data governance, privacy issues, where honestly you cannot let the marketers be unsupervised. They don't take those things very seriously. So you really do need the people who are a little more responsible to handle some of that stuff.
Yeah, that's a nice segue into I think any conversation that we have with you, or I'm sure that you have on any forum about CDPs, inevitably brings you to privacy. And also now I'm sure about generative AI and things like that, which we'll cover in just a bit. But how are you seeing the sort of privacy specifically as it relates to CDP evolve this year in the first, let's say, 6 months? And are there any major trend that you think people should be aware of as they're thinking through this?
Well, privacy is evolving very rapidly. We used to joke a couple of years ago that GDPR was the CDP Vendor Full Employment Act, because there was so much work to be done to get your company GDPR compliant. There was exactly the same work that was needed to implement a CDP. You had to go out and find where all your data was. You had to connect up all those systems. You had to keep track of how the data was being used. You had to govern what was done with the data to make sure it was compliant. And those are all the things that exactly a CDP does for you, or at least they are either required for a CDP or that a CDP actually can handle. I think more recently, what we've seen is a clear definition of where the CDP sits in all that and where other systems do. There are obviously privacy management systems. It's a huge and growing industry. So the data discovery and data classification generally sits outside the CDP, and the CDP vendors are okay with that. They don't really claim to do that. This is an area where I'm sure we'll touch on AI later, but where AI plays a major role in just sort of looking at what's out there and figuring out where all that personal information is hiding because it's not necessarily labeled properly. On the other hand, the CDP really should be the one place where people access customer data. And that means that the CDPs have to have a policy engine in place that governs that access and makes sure that people are doing things that they're permitted to do and not doing things that they're not permitted to do. And that depends not just on who they are, but more importantly on where the customer is, which regimes are in place, because different areas, and yes, even different states, in most countries, it's a national level policy, have different rules, and you have to enforce those. Once you're enforcing the access, now that gives you an obvious place to keep track of the usage of the data, the record of processing activity that's required. Again, the CDP is the obvious place to do that. Is the CDP the obvious place to capture consent? Maybe. Some CDP vendors have built the actual user interfaces to capture user consent and manage it, and to even accept access requests from people. And others say, no, there are other systems to do that. We don't really need to be experts in it. It's a little afield from the core CDP functionality of building and managing customer data. So we're beginning to see a little more clarity in what belongs inside the CDP and what doesn't belong inside the CDP. And of course, that's a good thing. The other side of that coin, of course, is the privacy rules keep changing. And you touched briefly earlier on sharing data with other companies in the context of external data access. And of course, that brings you to the data clean room world, which is where most of that sharing takes place in a privacy-safe fashion. And again, there's a little bit of question as to whether that belongs in the CDP or not. You could make the argument both ways. There are certainly specialist data cleanroom vendors, and it is a different technology. So probably it is something that doesn't necessarily belong in the CDP in the long run, but you could make the case that it does. So, there are still some areas to be worked out.
I think that point about whether the CDP collects consent or not is a relevant one. Just, I think earlier in the week, I was talking to a leading UK retailer, and they were actually pushing for sort of including consent collection as part of the sort of CDP RFP that they were discussing, right? And at least my argument to them was similar to yours in the sense that it makes sense for the CDP to be adjacent when to where the consent is being collected and bring that and sort of make sure that downstream systems adhere to that, but not necessarily be the system that ultimately collects consent. Why do you think people are asking for this? Is it just convenience that, okay, you know what, let's just throw in one more functionality into the CDP so that my job becomes easy? Or is there some other logical sort of business need for the CDP to be also collecting consent?
Well, again, you can make the case that the CDP is the repository for that data, so the CDP should be collecting it directly. I think honestly, people have a list of pain points, and we've seen this over the years in many IT projects. It's the classic scope creep problem. People say, "Oh, you have a new system. Well, I have this problem. Maybe that system can solve this problem for me." Whether or not that really makes any sense. And of course, the people who are sponsoring the system want as much support as they can get. So, sure, we'll add that to the list. And then the list gets very long, and that's where you get into problems, projects that become unwieldy. So I think that's the major issue. It's like they see this, it's related to customer data, it's a problem they have. They don't have a solution in place. If they can get one solution that also does that, so much the better. It saves them some grief. But yeah, I think you and I are on the same page that CDPs by and large don't interface directly with customers. They don't have user interface, customer consumer interfaces. So now all of a sudden you're adding one. It's not really a core competency of the CDP vendor. And that whole management of how you interact with your customers in a context of privacy is very, very important. It's an increasingly critical issue for many customers to understand what you're doing with their data, to trust that you're managing it correctly, to have control. So you really need to do that in a very careful and customer-centric way. And that's a skill. And it's not that the CDP vendors couldn't hire people who do that or train up their people, but it's a new thing for them. And honestly, I think there are other people who do it better, and other people who are going to focus on giving the marketers or the customer support people, or whoever kind of owns that process, all the options to set up that customer trust center in a way that's really best for their company. And a CDP vendor, that's probably not going to be the thing that they are really most skilled at.
Absolutely, I agree with you on that. Let's move to a topic that I think everybody sort of, when I ask folks what do they want to hear when they speak with you, I think this was by far the number one. And I'm sure you now in multiple forums get asked this every time, but we simply cannot not talk about generative AI and the immense progress that we've seen in just a matter of few months. So let's start with the first and most basic question. How should, and maybe this is not even CDP related, it's just maybe slightly broader, and I just ask this to you, is how should business leaders think about this development, this sort of really, really quick development in generative AI and LLMs? How should they wrap their head around this, and any framework that you can give for people?
Well, obviously this is something we think about quite a bit. Actually, the last couple of days I've been very focused on it because I was preparing a keynote, and the truth of the matter is I came up with a headline that was a good sort of link bait headline, That was, AI is not the future of marketing. Excellent headline. I had no idea what the speech was going to be, but it was a good headline, right? So good topic for the speech. And then I was chatting with the, the conference people, and well, all right, so I went out and asked GPT, well, what's the outline for this speech with this headline? And it came back with not a bad outline, actually. It was kind of what I was thinking. And what it kind of said was, well, AI is great at some things, but AI doesn't understand human emotions, so you still need the human touch. And I looked at it and said, well, okay, that was what I was thinking. But, that's very much conventional wisdom. And if I can get that out of ChatGPT, they don't need me to give that keynote. They can just let the computer, I'll give it a little AI voice to text thing or text to voice generator. We have those. We use them here, actually. And then I don't have to go to this conference, and it saves me a trip to London. But okay, I don't want to do that. I want to actually add more value. So what's the next level of thought beyond that kind of obvious conclusion? And that's what AI is going to do for you. It's going to give you a sort of common sense, conventional wisdom. This is what it found when it was searching the literature, because that's really all it does. So if you want to have that, then AI is great. If you want to have a, dare I say, mediocre marketing content, AI will do that for you. And sometimes mediocre is all you need. I mean, for things like journey path development, honestly, how creative is that stuff? The marketers will probably tell me it's very creative, so I shouldn't say this out loud. But by and large, people are just delighted to have one at all, right? Because they're hard enough to build without trying to be super creative about it. And anyhow, you're kind of trying to follow what your customers are doing, not blaze some new crazy journey that they're not interested in to begin with. So, there are things that AI is going to do really well. It's going to replace a lot of work, and AI will be creative. I think there's this kind of myth that AI won't be creative. Yeah, you can actually tell the AI to be creative. It'll scour the internet for clever things, and it'll say, oh, this was done over here, and now you can do something similar like that over there. It'll be, again, creative enough. But will it have truly unique thoughts? Will it pull things together in a viewpoint with a coherence that a human expert will do? No, and that's actually what my speech will be about. Is okay, AI is going to be good at some things. It's not going to be good at other things. It's not really going to be able to see the future. First of all, not that humans are very good at seeing the future, but AI is only going to look back at what's been done, not what hasn't been done. I'm actually looking at my notes that I put down last night. And AI is not going to give you better data. And AI is driven by data, right? So I was thinking again in the context of the speech, and I'm sorry that I'm probably talking longer than I should here, but it's obviously top of mind for me, is I would say, well, okay, if everybody's going to have sort of this pretty high level of AI generated content now, and program design, and a lot of other things that AI is going to do a perfectly competent job to do, right? Because the average company is going to do an average job. And on average, right? Some companies better, some worse, but most companies, by definition, will be average, and AI will be at least as good as average. So what will differentiate companies actually is the quality of the data that you feed into the AI. So, and I'd say that obviously I, work in the customer data world, but even if I didn't, I would say that's really where companies are going to differentiate themselves. Because if you can feed better data into your AI, you will actually get better and more unique output from the AI. So that's one of the areas that companies really are going to have to focus on to take advantage, to thrive in an AI managed world. And I guess I have to stop here because I'm kind of going on a little bit too long. But but the other thing that'll be a differentiator is the customer experience, which is not going to be driven by AI at all. If you think about it, you think about commodity industries, airlines, and financial services for that matter. Products aren't that different, right? Why do I deal with one company versus another? It's better CX. They smile at me more. They have better agents. Their policies are a little more friendly. Maybe I like the cook. Whatever it is, it's actually not something AI is ever going to change, because that really is about that one-to-one personal live experience, or even if it's an automated experience, it's still not really an AI generated experience. It's very much about how the company deals with the customer directly. So there are going to be a couple of areas where that AI is not going to be able to by itself fix for you. And those are going to be the areas in an AI-driven world where companies are going to differentiate themselves. So I'm sorry for a long speech, but
no, I
now you don't have to go to that conference in London.
Yeah, well, you had your dry run right there, but I mean, there's a lot of big and important sort of takeaways that you called out. Not least of which was one of the questions which I was going to ask you, which is how do you see the role of CDPs? And obviously, where AI is concerned, it's like you said, it's all about data. If you get that right, and the quality of the data that goes in does make a difference. So you did answer that question of mine. But I think the other question that invariably gets asked, and especially in a crowded, cluttered sort of CDP space that we are sort of used to seeing now, is the role of the CDP and how close it should be to the AI itself. Is it an enabler in the sense that it just provides the data required, or do you see CDP providers sort of offering certain tightly integrated AI capabilities and the pros and cons of each?
Oh yeah, no, AI has a huge role to play in CDP. I think, we talk a lot about content generation, but AI has a very major role in data analysis, in understanding the data that's there, making the analysts work easier, coming up with insights. Again, AI will find very good insights in your data, things that you would not have noticed yourself. It's really good at pattern recognition. It's one of the things that AI does. And AI also, this gets a little less attention, although we're seeing it more now, can help with the mechanics. We talked earlier about analyzing data sources to understand the content of data sources. So when you want to integrate a new data source, rather than having a human analyst look at the data and understand it and model it, and which is the way it works now. And human analysts are good at what they do, but there are not that many of them, and they're expensive and they're relatively slow compared to AI. So the AI should be able to automate that process, or at least be an assistant. You don't want to let the AI totally automate it, but the AI should be able to speed that process substantially by surfacing things that an analyst needs to look at and understand. So I think those are all areas, and Denny resolution is another one where AI will have a huge impact. So those are all areas where the AI will work within the CDP to make the CDP a much more powerful, efficient, cost-effective tool than it would be without AI. So there's lots and lots of work to be done by the CDP vendors to take advantage of all those things.
I think I would love to keep grilling you on this, and I'm sure I can see you're also excited to answer many of these questions. But of course, maybe in fact, it would actually not be a bad idea for us to connect and sort of do one more session only on generative AI plus CDPs. Maybe I'll reach out to you for that separately. But for today's summit, David, thank you so much for joining us. It's super insightful as always to hear from you. I think we are just on time here, but if someone has a quick question, I can throw it in. Otherwise, I will sort of close this session with David. Okay, fantastic. So yeah, David, thanks a lot. Really, really appreciate your time this morning. And yeah, as I said, I will connect with you offline. I think you're going to be here in this part of the world soon, so we'll find a way to connect. Yeah,
we'll find a way. Okay, very good. Well, my pleasure. Thanks. Have a great conference. Take care.
Thank you.